we are back for another episode of the podcast. I am your wonderful host, Braylon Williams, the man who does it the most, the man who owns a design business as well as a podcast, as well as a substitute teacher, as well as just any idea that comes to mind. I'm 5'4", but I'm still a force to be reckoned with. But anyway, this is Enneagram Start Podcast, and this is a new episode, like I said. So thank you for joining me for this new episode. If you're new to this podcast, this is a podcast that I do every week, and it's just talking about how the Enneagram is, in my opinion, the best tool for self-development. I always say the way the Enneagram is meant to be used is to make the good better and the bad good. So it's always a good thing. And one of the things I like to start off at the very top of every episode before I tell you about what's happening in the show today is I like to talk a little bit about what's happening in my life recently. Well, and it's really not recently because a lot of these episodes are pre-recorded way before they even get released. And so by the time you're hearing this, it's like, I believe, August, almost September. But this is currently May when I record this. But with that in mind, I've said this before in previous episodes, but just kind of starting to feel a little bit of nervousness, a little bit of instability because this is literally the last week of school, and summer school doesn't start till June. So it's like, what am I going to do in between then, and then also what am I going to do for July and half of August without knowing where my source of income is coming from. So that's the biggest thing that is just facing me critically. That is like, oh my gosh, what is happening type of deal. But on a more lighthearted note, I've been thinking about some ideas. So I'm going to throw this out, and about the time you hear this, I probably would have already did like a email blast or social media poll if these are good ideas. But in the Enneagram world, I've been thinking about hosting an Enneagram seminar online. It's kind of like all the basics for anybody who might be interested in learning it, as well as like maybe you've heard of it but don't quite know what it is, or maybe you've like taken a test and you've kind of read a little bit about it, but don't really prescribe to it yet. This is like, all right. When I say seminar, it is basically that. Imagine a freshman seminar class at your college campus, and it's going to be that around the Enneagram, maybe a half day, full day. Like I said, it's just an idea at this point, working out all the details, if it will even happen. But then on the design side of my life, the interior design side of my life, I've also been thinking about hosting a color workshop. One of the things that I specialize in as a designer is picking out the perfect color palette for your paint of your home. So thinking about kind of taking people through my process a little bit of how I choose a palette for a home and how that comes to life and what each color sort of means in that palette, and why I believe they are the best choices. So those are just two event ideas, both virtual, that I'm thinking about doing. But I will say that if I do them, it probably won't be till maybe the end of this year, if not next year, that those things happen. So, but you can always be out on the lookout for those, because you never know. I might be like, oh, this can happen now, so let's just go ahead and do it. So yeah. But yeah, that's just kind of pretty much where I am in life right now. Some of the things I'm thinking about, some of the things that are rolling around in my mind. My mind is a dangerous minefield. You never know what you're going to get. So you might step on a landmine and hit gold, or you might step on a landmine and, die. My mind is a scary place. Mainly filled with great ideas. I'm a visionary. I'm an entrepreneur. So there's always something running around in my mind of how to, create a product or a service or make money. So, yeah. But anyway, today's episode is another great guest episode because I am joined by Brian Lee today. Brian Lee is an Enneagram 1, and which in the 3 years that I've been doing this podcast, honestly, I have to be honest, this is the very first time that I'm having an Enneagram 1 as a guest. So that is a monumental moment. I've had 8s, I've had 7s, I've had 3s. I think I even have a 2 in there somewhere. And I think a 9 as well. But he is for sure the very first Enneagram Type 1 that is on this podcast. So this is a monumental moment. But anyway, Brian is an Enneagram coach, and he has recently started Broken to Beloved, which is an organization that exists to help victims and survivors of spiritual abuse, religious trauma, and church harm, and to offer practical pathways toward healing and wholeness by providing resources for recovery. Broken to Beloved also works to raise awareness and create safeguarding measures for pastors, leaders, and churches who want to build healthy, trauma-informed environments. As you can see, he is a great guy. He also his Instagram account is titled Gospel Center Enneagram, and that's kind of what his practice. I think that's the name of his Enneagram practice, counseling practice is Gospel Center Enneagram. Has a lot of great resources on his website, but I can put all that information, website links, and all that in the show notes below that you can click when you finish listening or watching this episode. But right now, let's talk to Brian. Let's learn a little bit more about his story, as well as what he had. What I've got a couple questions I'm going to ask him, and I'm going to get his opinions on these questions, and we're going to just have a great conversation as usual here on the podcast.
Ta-da.
I just didn't want to have to. I wanted to be able to see you in real time. It's crazy because I was just talking to I think it was Krista last week, and I was telling her how I've just started using StreamYard this go around, and I haven't had a glitch yet, and then today I knocked on wood and it happened now. So now that that's fixed, I think everything else is good to go.
Thanks for being so patient and flexible. Sorry
Oh,
about that.
oh, no worries. I am. Whenever I have a guest on, because I'm a substitute teacher and it's kind of hard to like actually just split my days to where like I can actually go back to work. I just end up taking the full day off, and so usually I have nothing else to do. So I'm more than glad to be flexible. So
Nice.
um, make sure I'm in the right spot in my notes. Yep. Well, we can just kick it off, and let me just start by saying welcome to the podcast. I know this is the first time of having you on here, and also I hope you feel honored because you're the first Type 1 that I've ever had on this podcast, and I've been doing it since 2021. So
Hey now.
you are the first. I'm marking this as a monumental episode. I've always run into like other 8s, other 8s, other 3s, sometimes 2s, and run into 7s. But like usually, I think it's just me being a assertive type. I'm like, where are the other assertive type people? I want to connect with them, but I need to start
Are
connecting
you
more
type
with.
8?
I'm 3,
3.
so uh, I misidentified myself as an 8, and so I'm getting
Okay.
used to saying no, I'm a 3 now. So usually I'll switch up. I'm like, oh wait, I'm a 3 now because I gave myself the wrong number at first. So and before we just like, you know, I've this is like the first time we've met, and so anytime I
Mm-hmm.
meet somebody new for the first time, of course, I can go on your website and read all about you, but I like to hearing people's story from their own like voice. It's something. It helps me understand it better. So, just tell me a little bit about your story as a human being, as well as your Enneagram journey story.
Sure. Um, well, I think you reached out to me on my Gospel Centered Enneagram site. So that's probably the
Right.
context for which you know me. Um, and that story has a lot to do with the title you see down there for Broken to Beloved. I've been a pastor for over 20 years, grew up in the church, grew up as a pastor's kid, um, and was a very late bloomer, is the nice way to say it. Um, and I think even well into my college years and young adulthood, I think I was just blissfully and painfully unaware of myself,
Mm,
just kind of floating through life, all personality and very little substance. And it wasn't until I was working in a church or working in a faith-based environment, where I experienced some fairly toxic things. It's also where I kind of first ran into personality tests like the Myers-Briggs, like the DISC assessment, and a couple other ones, and just was fascinated by these tools that seem to read who you are, um, and just know the inner workings of what's going on, right?
right.
Um, Fast forward a bunch of years, and I have back to back toxic work environments where I choose to leave for the sake of my own sanity and health, and realize that, you know, we all hear the phrase hurt people hurt people. And I recognize that it's the ones who are just really self ignorant or unaware that just leave this wake of destruction behind them because they have no idea the effect they have on other people, or what it's like to be around them. And so I kind of made a vow to myself after those two experiences is that I needed to learn as much as I could about myself so that I didn't do that to other people around me. Already aware that I've already done it to people around me.
Yeah.
And so when I discovered the tool of the Enneagram, it was the one that kind of opened my eyes the most because all these other tools tend to focus on behaviors and what we do versus the Enneagram really breaking down why we do it and getting to those underlying motivations, was a big wake up call for me.
Yeah.
And I think I recognized, especially as a type one, just how black and white I saw things in the world and just how much I viewed things with this worldview of right, wrong, good, bad, and how often I disappointed myself, didn't meet my own expectations, and then would take out my frustration and resentment on everyone else around me and just made them pay the price for my own, shortcomings. Um, and so learning about the Enneagram for me was a huge wake up call to recognize A, that I do that at all. B, it's not great.
Yeah.
And as much as I've experienced harmful behavior from other people, I recognize I was like, oh, I've actually been really harmful to people too. And so, what do I need to do to change that? And how can I go back and make amends if possible? Um, and then just using that information to embrace a lot more gray and a lot more middle ground and being unsure about things and recognizing that people being different from me is actually a good thing. That we need that diversity of thought and behavior and feelings in order to more fully and wholly represent who we are. Um, yeah, so that's kind of how I came across the Enneagram, and so I've been using it now for I don't know how many years. Been coaching with it. I work with individuals, couples, churches, teams, that kind of stuff, and then have also started Broken to Beloved, which is a 501c3 nonprofit, out of my own personal experience with spiritual abuse and religious trauma and church harm, to help resource other people who have experienced it to find practical pathways toward healing and wholeness.
I love it. You were saying there about in your story, and it just reminded me of why I titled this podcast Enneagram Restored, because
Hmm.
your story was a reminder. That's what the Enneagram does, is restoring you to and I would say not the same, but a more valued version of your original self. A lot of times I
Mm.
think of it in the manner, if you're restoring old hardwood floors, it's the original floors, but they just look better than they originally did when they were even manufactured, because you had to put so much love and so much work into it. And so that story just served as a sweet reminder of that, and I just wanted to point that out. I also want to be sure, because I'm trying to get better at this. I'm a very direct conversationalist, and so that can also lead me to speaking too fast, as well as like not taking moments out to allow the guest to speak before I move on. And I really hate that because I want this to feel more like a conversation than it is an actual interview. And so at any time, feel free to interject. Even if I'm in the middle of reading a question, you can interject and we can always come back to it. So just want to make sure I put that out there because I
Thank
can
you.
do that sometimes. So with that being said, we can just kind of really start to get there. And I've been telling every guest this, and I kind of said a little bit in the email, but this season of the podcast is about active waiting, what that means, and how to do it productively. And I would also kind of tie the phrase liminal space to this active waiting phrase too, because they kind of probably I haven't really looked into it, but to me they seem like two peas in a pod, if not just synonyms for each other. But with that theme being the overarching theme for the entire season, I've always start out every episode asking these same two questions to everybody. And those questions are, how would you personally define active waiting? And then also, how has it like manifested in your life and how have you handled it?
That's a great question. And I love that you kind of distinguish the active waiting versus passive waiting. Because I think very often we're just passively waiting for things as if we're not participants in what's happening. And active waiting kind of presumes anticipation of something. It's when you're looking forward to something, even if that looking forward is looking forward to something being over,
Yeah.
right? And it's that, and I think liminal is exactly the right word. I use it a lot. I've studied it a lot, and it's that weird in between space when you're not where you've been anymore, but you're also not quite where you're going yet. And so usually you feel very untethered. You feel kind of lost, like you're in limbo. Um, and the weird thing about it in that active waiting space, and sometimes passive, because sometimes there's not much you can do except just to wait. And
Right.
even that can be an active thing just by being mindful of it and aware of it. Is there are a lot of times where we don't even recognize that the waiting is over anymore until we look back and recognize we're already in the next thing. Without an awareness or without like a hard date sort of a thing where we know this event is happening on this day, a wedding, a funeral, an engagement, a graduation, any of these really clearly defined things, a 21st birthday, a whatever it is. When we don't have specific dates assigned to things, it can just feel like, I don't know when this season's going to be over, and I really can't wait to get to the next thing. But there's no really clear marker for me. So what does it look like to be in that waiting space? And there are a lot of people who, when they talk about that liminal space, say it's really the only time that we're actually able to learn from God is in that space, because it's when we're unsure of things.
Right.
And so the way I try to approach it is with a really conscious sense of openness of, is there something for me to be learning in this space or figuring out, or even just asking questions about? I think as a one, I appreciate or enjoy or take for granted the certainty around things.
Right.
And this liminal space and this waiting has taught me to be uncertain of a lot, that I know a lot less than I think I do. And so, what does it look like to approach this season with open hands, just to say, I don't know what's next, but I want to be ready for it when it comes. And so, whatever the possibilities are, without me having to control the whole situation, because more often than not, control is an illusion, how do I step into this with anticipation and openness to receive whatever comes next?
Right. Hey, everybody. I just want to take a quick break from the show to say that I love having conversations with all of my listeners. And one of the ways that I do this is by engaging through social media. And you can follow the podcast at Enneagram Store Podcast on both Instagram and Facebook. I look forward to to engaging with you all more on those platforms. You said you've done some study into liminal space, which I love that because I have not, and so this just pairs really well with my next question because I often approach a lot of things trying to figure out from the emotional stance of things, and so I don't know if you can answer this question, but it's like the question is, this isn't what I wrote down, so I'm trying to actually form it in my head right now. um, what like what's like the emotional state, the mental state of someone in the liminal space?
It cut out a little, so I'm going to ask it again. So, what's the emotional state of someone in liminal space? Was that the question?
Yeah.
Okay. Um, I'm not really sure.
Not?
And it really depends on the individual, right? For where you're at and how aware you even are of it. Um, I tend to be fairly detached from my emotions, and I'm learning to get better at identifying them
Same.
um, after the fact, if not in real time. And I think that just trying to be mindful at all can be helpful, right? Um, and whether you use a feelings wheel or you talk about the 8 feelings from Voice of the Heart, um, a pri- like I would imagine five, sixes, and sevens in the head triad would be dealing a lot with fear and anxiety because that's kind of a natural stance for them, right?
Right.
Is feeling those feelings of I don't know what's happening, I don't know what comes next, and kind of being consumed by those things. People in the heart triad might be consumed with feelings around their relationships, feelings around their sense of identity. Hey, if I'm in between these things, who am I? Right?
Mm.
And people in the gut triad might be consumed with feelings that really aren't so much feelings so much as they are sensations in their body. I think eights, nines, and ones get away with saying they're feeling something, but really they're physically feeling, like sensing something. Um, I feel angry. I feel cold. I feel tension, right? Um, they're sensing words much less than emotional words. So I think just even learning how to identify and name those things can be helpful. But I think it also has to do with letting go, like I said earlier, of that sense of certainty and being okay with the middle spaces and the in between spaces, the threshold spaces, is what the word liminal comes from. Um, and I think when it comes to identifying emotional stuff, um, I mean it's work for all of us. Fours might be the most in tune with it, just because they're in touch with their own emotions. Twos are going to be feeling everyone else's feelings. Threes are going to interpret those feelings, but then not use them productively. Um, we all come at it from such a different place and from such a different point of view. I think in the work that I do with the Enneagram, the most useful thing is just to be aware of whatever it is that you're feeling or sensing, and then asking the questions around those.
Right. And you briefly mentioned about uncertainty and being okay with that. And I know myself, but also just humans in general, surrendering is like our not something is our go-to tool. So, what are like some practical tips, advice you would say? Hey, practice this in order to get better at being okay with uncertainty.
Hmm. Um, I think my advice might be different for all the different centers
You
or
could go into.
stances based on where the work is for each of us,
Okay.
right? Eights, nines, and ones, um, we love our autonomy and control. We want to do things how we want, when we want, the way we want to. And so learning to occupy that waiting space is learning to let go of control. which can be so hard to not control
Right.
the outcomes. Um, and same with lots of other types and numbers for different reasons. Um, and depending on which stance you're in, whether you're experiencing those repressed or unproductive thoughts, feelings, or behaviors, it's learning to recognize, what do I have control over in this space, which may be very little and it may be a lot. That's going to look different for each of us. Um, and what is my role, or what is my work in this? Because I can't
Right.
own someone else's anxiety. I can let it affect me, but that's a choice too.
Right.
Because I can also learn to draw boundaries that are healthy for me. I can also put up really unhealthy boundaries that don't let anyone in and isolate myself. I can choose to keep trying to control situations or outcomes. And then every time it doesn't work out, I can get more and more frustrated. Um, I can choose nines, can let go of control to the other extreme in an unhealthy way of I'm just going to go along with it and let the tide carry me however it wants. um, it's like, well, you also need to claim a little ownership and agency for yourself too, right?
Right.
um, so I think it really depends on knowing your own strengths and weaknesses, recognizing what you do have control over, what you can do in those moments, and then somehow being able to release, not all of it, because I don't know that that's possible for any of us, but release,
I wish.
if not release, at least acknowledge that that tendency is there to want to
Right.
hold on to whatever it is in that waiting space. And if you can just acknowledge it, that's a step in that direction.
Right. I like that. I'm getting so many questions that I do not have in my notes, and so I'm like, ugh. I need to form them better in my mind. How how has your uh, let me back up a little bit, trying to think here. Ones, help me remember this because I'm horrible at remembering the lines of movement for each type. Ones go to what number in stress?
4,
4, and then their security number is
7.
7. So like how has that affected your uh, waiting seasons, going moving in between those lines for you?
Hmm. Yeah. Um, if we're taking just the very stereotypical behaviors of a one,
Right.
which I surprisingly follow fairly often, the unhealthy behaviors that come out when I'm in a season of waiting, when I'm too stressed or overwhelmed or just too uncertain, is I start getting in my feels,
Mm.
or I start thinking, oh, what's wrong with me? Or why am I missing out on this thing? Or why don't I have this thing yet? Um, and so I've learned to become aware of those thoughts and feelings when they happen. It's like, oh, okay, this is a signal for me. This is a rumble strip that I'm not doing well.
Mm. I like that rumble strip.
And then on the other side, the path to 7 is, because it can be both healthy and unhealthy in both directions, um, is kind of having this monkey brain that can't focus on anything. And I just get overly spontaneous and want to do something. Sometimes it's fun, sometimes it's reckless. And it's just like, I don't, what's happening right now?
Yeah.
This is out of character for me. So what's going on? And all I know is I need an escape hatch because I need to get out of
Mm.
whatever it is. And when we're in that waiting season, there often isn't an escape hatch. You just have to wait it out.
Right.
So recognizing that sense of restlessness for me is also a signal and a rumble strip. It's like, okay, something's off. I should be paying attention. And sometimes, and listen, like these paths are survival mechanisms for us. They're not bad things in and of themselves. They're just signs and signals.
Right.
So if we can learn to pay attention to them, we can get ourselves back on track, or we can access those paths in a healthy, resourceful way rather than just a kind of instinctive reactions.
I like that. There's another question in my mind, but of course, as usual, I have all these questions I plan out on my notes, but then I start talking to guests. I'm like, how come that question didn't come up before in all my prep? But anyway, I'll move back to my notes now, so it's a little bit easier for me. So the actual like topic that I've titled this episode is "Time to Heal," and that's because a little bit on my personal story is that as a 3 and as an assertive type, I'm always on the go. Often like, what's the next thing to work on? What's the next idea? Like literally, yesterday I had two different ideas come to my head about like virtual events that I could produce and host, and then another one came on into my head today about a networking event that I can do in the Springfield area. And so it's like always new ideas. And then I'm also an ENTP on the Myers Briggs, and then just a visionary and entrepreneurial since birth. And so it's like, gosh, brain, can you stop thinking for one moment? But this past year, I've been forced, I say forced, but to resting and to solitude. And this moment of resting, this moment of being alone, has caused me to realize and recognize some unresolved brokenness, trauma, and hurt that just have kind of put in a glass container and shelved away in the deep crevices of my soul. And so, kind of starting out from a general sense, how might someone, if you want to, you can talk in a general sense as a whole, or you can go generally for every type, but how might someone lean into their brokenness to gain healing from it?
That's a great question. Um, and it's, I think, where I've spent the majority of my time over the last 2 years is leaning into that brokenness to see what comes out of it. Um, it's a big part of why I named the nonprofit Broken to Beloved, is because I over identified myself as broken for so long. For like over 10 years, I just saw myself as broken. I would introduce myself in interviews as damaged goods when I would walk into churches or interview to be part of a staff somewhere. And it's just how I saw myself. And I think I saw that, when we talk about that connection to four, when I was deep in those moments, I saw myself as irredeemably deficient. Something is so wrong with me, no one will ever want me or love me. And so learning to recognize that my identity is not wrapped up in what happened to me, is not wrapped up in what I do or what I have or what other people say or think about me, right? Henry Nouwen's three lies. And it is rooted and identified for me in my identity in Christ. Just to say, okay, I have worth, I have value because this is who God says I am. And not everyone believes that, and that's fine. But for me, that's kind of what gives me this sense of rootedness. And then I've just been doing a lot of reading over the last couple of years around this idea of belovedness and recognizing that broken can be something that happens to you. It does not have to identify you.
Yeah.
And so there are a couple of different versions of, or illustrations, I guess we could say, of ways that this works. And one of them is the idea of kintsugi, right? It's this Japanese art form
Yeah.
of restoring broken pottery and ceramics, where something that is beloved, a beloved piece of art or an heirloom or just a household item that you just love, somehow gets shattered and broken into pieces. And rather than throw it away, you take it to a craftsman who puts it back together with all this lacquer and glue and carefully
Right.
rearranges the pieces. And then they overlay all of the cracks rather than trying to hide them and pretend that it was never broken in the first place. They highlight it with gold.
Yeah.
And so when it comes back to you, it's whole again, but now it has all these cracks highlighted in gold. And now, because the time has been taken to restore this piece, it is now actually worth more because of its scars, because of its cracks and breaks, and because of the care that was taken to put it back together. And I think a lot of times we don't often see ourselves in that same way. But for people out there who feel broken, there is a process where you can be restored and where you don't have to hide or conceal the things that broke you. There can be beauty in highlighting those things and sharing them with the world to say, hey, these are the ways that I was broken. And look, I've been put back together. There's another book I just finished reading 2 days ago called The Understory by Lori Wilbert. And it's this idea that She lives up in the Adirondacks in upstate New York and loves to go out into the woods in these old growth forests. And there's this idea that what happens when a tree dies and falls over and it just starts to rot. And it's really easy to just look at that thing and be like, oh, that poor tree, it's dead. It's been around for hundreds of years and now it's just gone. And now there's just death and decay. And what we often don't realize or see or stop to notice is that it's actually more alive now than it ever was because of everything that it is feeding in its
Right.
death. And this idea of restoration in brokenness and in death, when you look under the surface at all the fallen leaves that are rotting and the life that's happening under the ground to restore and bring new life out of that death, um, there's that sense of hope and resurrection that comes even in those moments where it just looks like decay. So I think for me, when I recognize and identify with so many people that I come across who come absolutely broken and shattered by their circumstances or by abuse or trauma or things that have happened to them, it's not somewhere you have to stay. You're not
Right.
crazy for thinking what you've thought. More often than not, especially in instances of abuse, it wasn't your fault. Someone did this to you, and it's not your identity. This doesn't define you for the rest of your life. There's hope on the other side of it. And yes, you can carry the scars, but those scars don't have to bring extra shame. They can bring a little bit of beauty back into the world.
Right. Well, first I just love that tree analogy. I never connected that. I always knew that when trees die, they actually help fuel more life because of what they give in the nutrients to the soil.
Mm-hmm.
But making a connection to the human life, I thank you for that because never would have thought of it that way. Um, but yeah, it's so true because even for myself, I've been learning that too. There's an instance, personal journey that I have been coming to realize, like, of being more okay with sharing it. Right now, there's only a few. There's only one other person on this earth who knows about this incident, and it's a former counselor. So it's like, I think it's really away from the shame of what that brings, and rather than feeling like being like made less than because I went through that experience, and saying, "Oh wait, it's okay that that happened. How can this be used to not only encourage myself more, but how can it encourage other people to get beyond that moment and the shame that comes from such a experience?"
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
and so,
And it doesn't have to be okay that it happened.
yeah,
It can really be not okay because in a lot of instances, especially with abuse and trauma, it's like it's absolutely not okay that that happened to you, and I'm really sorry that it happened to you. And I also don't want you to bypass your own experience and just skip over it or pretend like everything's going to be fine. There's the work of processing all of that stuff too
right,
and coming to terms with it, um, in a way that does feel restorative and not like we just have to skip over this chapter of your life, right? What happened to you is real. So
right,
what do you do with it, right? And what do you do in that waiting space in between the event that happened and feeling whole again someday? And we walk through it and we own the whole thing.
I love that. Ooh, you're just giving me so much to think about. Try, I don't want to move on too quickly, but I'm like, just it's just making me think personally. It's making me take a moment out. I'm like,
Yeah,
this
take your
what I'm
time.
thinking has nothing to do with the podcast, and so, but kind of moving to the next question, which is, what are some indicators that are like type specific that might help us push? I think I'm saying this wrong. What are some indicators that could be type specific that might be saying, hey, we're trying to push past our trauma instead of recognizing it, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I'm trying to decide if I can even answer that question.
Yeah, I know it's it's
um,
it's a tough one.
it is a tough one. Well, and I think because the nature of trauma is so personal, and so unique. Um, it would be impossible is the wrong word, um, but it would be awfully presumptive of me to try to prescribe
Yeah.
some kind of way of processing that for each type. That being said, again, if we can come to the table with our own sense of awareness in hand of where we tend to focus our attention, it can help us to process that trauma a little more quickly. So, for a one who's all wrapped up in black and white and good and bad and right and wrong, learning to identify the trauma and put it in its right place, um, ones already carry so much guilt and shame. And so, how much of that is really yours to own
Right.
versus how much of it is the consequence of what happened to you, right? And so, being able to free yourself of some of that shame is going to be a major step. And that oftentimes there is no right way to deal with trauma. There are a lot of wrong ways, but there's no perfect way, I guess is the way to
Right.
say it. It's going to be an
Which
individual thing for everybody.
yeah, which kind of
So,
makes
what
it
is
a little
just
bit
one
tough.
next step? It does. It does. But what is one next right thing that you can do?
Right.
Right. For twos, you're going to be so externally focused anyway. And your default is to focus on everyone else. And in this moment, you're really going to need to take care of yourself. And it can feel impossible for twos to identify their own needs. And so, what is a way that you would allow someone else to help you instead of the other way around? Or can you even recognize that maybe part of that trauma response is the compulsion to go help someone else instead
Yeah.
of sitting back or even just taking a break? What would it look like for you to just say no to something and recognize that your relationships will still be intact, that it'll be okay? You can sit this one out. For threes who just love to overfunction, trauma responses can often look like just jumping into more work to kind of numb the pain.
Right.
And so, what would it look like to actually sit with your feelings and recognize what happened to you and to be able to process that in a healthy way with someone and not carry that on your own? For fours, it's almost the opposite, that they're so easily swallowed up by those feelings. What does it look like to get outside of yourself just for a minute and process that again with someone else, whether it's a counselor, whether it's a trusted friend or someone who's close to you, just to recognize that someone else can carry that with you. It doesn't make you less of a person because it happened to you, because fours kind of already feel that way, that there's already something missing with them. And this just kind of makes them even more broken or more deficient.
Right.
You're still worthy of love and you're still worthy of care and relationship and all of those things. So, what does it look like to actually receive that instead of kind of playing the push pull game with people? For fives, it's so easy to get stuck in your head. It's easy to read and research the work around trauma, but what does it look like to actually do something with it?
Yeah.
Instead of just gathering the knowledge, what would it look like to take an actual practical step, do something with your body, get moving, take some kind of action that moves towards that healing and wholeness rather than just thinking about doing the healing and the work, to actually do something with it. Sixes, it's they get stereotyped as the worst case scenario thinkers, but really they're the every case scenario thinkers. And this is something that you probably didn't see coming. And that's okay. And often when trauma and abuse happen, one of the big side effects is that we feel stripped of our agency. It's this
Right.
idea that, like, I don't have any control. I can't make any choices. The choices are made for me. This is just kind of my fate or my destiny. And part of the healing process is learning to trust yourself again and to reclaim that agency. It's like, actually, I do have a say in what happens to me. I do have a say in how I choose to move forward in my life. And so for sixes, a big part of that step for them is to learn to trust yourself, trust your gut, trust your judgment. Think about or be reminded of the times where you've made a decision and it's worked out for you, right? All of those kinds of things. And sixes are so good at building their communities and the people around them. Lean on them, right? You don't need to gather 50 decisions or pieces of input from everyone, but what if you just did two or three and just say, hey, can you help me? Like, can I trust myself right now? And get people to echo that back to you. For sevens, I mean, they have that half range of emotions and they're going to have a hard time. When trauma hits, it can be devastating because now real life has shown its head. Um, and how do you choose a thoughtful response rather than default to an instinctive reaction? And rather than run, rather than jump to the next thing, how can you just sit just for a minute with what happened and face it? Like, don't run from it, don't hide from it, don't try to gloss over it, don't silver lining it. Can you just admit and own that this was a really hard thing, that this was a really tough thing that happened? Um, and then move on, but at least just sit with it for a minute. For eights, it's all that power and control. It's all of those really hard fortified defenses and walls. I'm not going to let anyone in. And inside, there's that really soft, vulnerable interior. And people can help you if you will let them. People can love you if you will let them in. And with eights, trauma is so hard because there's already a fear of betrayal. And that's what trauma is. That's what abuse is. Um, and will you allow yourself to feel those soft, vulnerable feelings, knowing that it may happen again someday? But is there someone you can let in? Because we can't live our entire lives shutting everyone out.
Right.
And for nines, it's you got to stand up for yourself a little. They're so easygoing. They're so go with the flow. They're so trying to see things from everyone else's point of view. Can you name what happened to you? Can you allow yourself to feel the anger of being violated in some kind of a way that recognizes that you have worth and value and that what happened to you was not okay? Um, and so again, I just think going around the circle, it's like if we can just own and be aware of the way that we carry ourselves and the ways that we view the world and occupy it, and just bring that to the table with us when we recognize what's happened to us, it gives us a really good head start on processing all of that stuff together.
Yeah. I don't know how, and maybe this is just how it is, but like somehow every time I record an episode with a guest, you now and everyone before, the question that has become one of my favorite questions was actually inspired by Gene Stevens' book "What's Here Now." That "What's Here Now," and everything you just said right there is remind me of that question: What's here now? What's in the present moment? What can I
Mm-hmm.
do now? What am I thinking now? What am I feeling now? Why, in this moment, am I trying to run from this hurt instead of embracing it and trying to figure out what it's causing me internally? So I don't know if that's coincidence. I don't that question always comes back to mind, or if that's just how it works. But
Yeah,
that question of what's here now has just been a constant thing in my head with
I think
every
it's a great
conversation.
reminder.
So I'm going to phrase this next thing a little bit different. I wrote it. Actually, I'll tell you both ways because it might help. So originally, I had it have it out as how might each type use their strengths to help them heal from their trauma. But just as you were talking, it kind of came to me a different way, as in how might each type use their essence to heal from their trauma. Uh, and I'm a little bit new to the virtues and essence side of the Enneagram, and so I don't have them all memorized. Really, at this point, the only one I have memorized is the three, which is authenticity. Um, so I don't know if you do either. I should have pulled them up. I have them somewhere. Let's see. Actually, where is that? I have a. There's a book that I have that has them in it. I don't know where it's at right now, so I don't think I can pull them up. Trying to think where it is. Anyway, do you know them by heart?
I'm trying to see if I can pull them up somewhere too, because I think I have.
I just had that book with me the other day. I forgot where I put it. I think it's still in my backpack. Oh, it's right here.
Here we go. Well, and it can be tough too, because I think different teachers have different words for them.
Yeah. So I'm looking at Meredith. I can never say her name right. Something about that RED that just trips me up. Meredith Boggs' book, The Journey Home. She
Hmm.
has them listed as innocence for the 8, action for 9, serenity for 1, freedom for 2, authenticity for 3, equanimity for 4, open handedness for 5, courage for 6, and sobriety for 7.
Yeah, and I have fairly similar words. I think mine are a little bit different, but close enough. Um, so the question is, how do we lean into that virtue?
Yeah. And if not, you could just, like I said, that just came in my head. If you would just address it from the type's strength in general, that's good too. I just thought we could possibly go in that direction if possible, but if not, it's okay.
Um, in terms of dealing with the trauma, you said, is that what the question is?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think part of that, I think I answered a little bit of it in
Okay.
going around with each of the types. Um, for nines, it's that idea of right action. What does it look like to be in the right place at the right time, doing the right thing? Right, nines get this weird burst of energy when that right action happens, and all of a sudden they become this go-getter. They become this champion for this cause and whatever it is. What does it look like to champion yourself
Right.
and to own what happened to you? For ones, it's the idea of moving towards serenity. And I think we often mischaracterize serenity as, this meditative moment sitting on the beach under a palm tree. And I think another good word for serenity sometimes is surrender. And it's the idea
Wow.
that we can't control everything. The control's an illusion. So what does it look like to pray that serenity prayer of knowing the difference of what I can and cannot control and being okay with it in the middle?
I'm glad you
And so
said that
when it
because
comes,
I would never equate serenity to that. Like you said, I would have continued to use it as in that peaceful meditative state. So thank you for saying that.
yeah, I think that surrender is what gets us to that peaceful state, because if we're still trying to hold on to something too tight, there is no peace.
Yeah.
There's just the constant tension of not wanting to let this thing go. Right? For twos, it's a sense of humility, which comes out of that vice of pride. And it's not the pride of I'm proud of myself or I'm have a giant ego. It's the idea that they think they can serve all the people around them. And
Yeah.
so humility is this idea, what does it look like that I actually have needs? What does it look like that I want to be taken care of sometimes? And so allowing people to fill that space and role for you. For threes, I think you said, is it authenticity?
Yeah.
The word in front of me is veracity or truth telling.
Ooh.
And what does it look like to move from this vice or passion of deceit? And again, it's often not that we're lying to other people. It's you're lying to yourself that
Yeah.
I need to be this person or this thing in order to be successful in this room. And so, what does it look like to tell the truth and be authentic and just allow myself to be who I am when I wake up in the morning without needing to put on the extra face or the extra outfit or the extra thing that goes above and beyond? Threes already do so much more than the rest of us. And the rest
Right.
of us don't know how you do it. And then at the end, you're like, oh my gosh, I didn't get enough done, and I missed. It's like, what you did plenty. And so when it
Yes.
comes to the trauma, when it comes to dealing with and owning the things that have happened to us, it's a terrible thing and you don't need to pretend otherwise. What does it look like to tell the truth around that and to be okay being a mess for a little bit? We don't have to have it all together. And none of us have it all together. And you actually make yourself more human and more accessible and more approachable when you admit that you don't have it all together every once in a while.
Yeah.
For fours, equanimity. How do I even out all those highs and lows and find something that feels maybe a little bit more stable in between so that I'm not constantly being, tossed back and forth in that kind of a way? Fives, I forget what word you used. The one I have in front of me is non-attachment. How do I let go of the results and not be in control of those kinds of things all the time? Um, Fives so badly want to be competent and to know the results of something, um, and attach themselves to the value of knowledge that they have on something. And how do I let go of those kinds of things? For sixes, that courage, it's that courage. How do I move from fear and anxiety towards courage? And the difference between, I remember hearing the difference between bravery and courage. And bravery is kind of like overcoming your fear and just doing the brave thing. Courage is owning and feeling all of the fear and doing it
Yeah.
anyway, right? Sevens, sobriety. Um, just everything wants to be cranked up to 11 all the time, and they want all the options. And I've worked with several sevens who another word that they often use is contentment.
Mm.
And they pray that is it Teresa of Avila, I think, all is well and all shall be well,
Yeah.
right? And it's that idea of how do I learn to be content with my circumstances? What does it look like to move towards sobriety, which is that it's that sober mindedness. It's the reality. How do I find myself grounded in something rather than the need for more all the time? For eights, the virtue of innocence. And we said it before, like without having all those structures and walls and barriers up that prevent me from being vulnerable or allowed to be myself. What does it look like to move towards that innocence, to that childlike state that didn't have to grow up so quickly? And even if I'm not ready or willing to share it on the outside yet, can I at least access it and recognize that it's even still there, some
Right.
glimmer of hope, right? And I think nines we started with right action and just what do I do to what does it look like to move towards that for myself and advocate for myself?
Yeah. You were talking about sixes and the difference between courage and brave, and it just reminded me how I often, when I think about sixes, I often picture. I don't know if you've seen the old Cartoon Network show, Courage the Cowardly Dog. I don't know if you've ever seen it or heard it,
I've heard of it.
but that's the image I get every time I think of a six, and you remind me of that because one of the things he does is like he is a cowardly dog, but yet he still goes on to face whatever like trouble is happening in that episode with that like sense. All right, here I am. Don't want to be here, but I'm gonna do it because I have to, type of thing. Um, so I just wish he talked a little bit more. They one of the things they do in that cartoon is that they try not to make him too personified and give him a lot of talking lines, and so it's still from a pure dog perspective. And it's like, I wonder what he's thinking in that moment. But it's one of those fun things I haven't watched in a long time. I was reminded of that. It's like, hey, that's what that is like. And so just figured I'd throw that out there because I'm a visual person, and if anybody else is a visual person, that might be a good thing. But I also realize I'm getting to the point of age where like a lot of younger people don't know what I'm referencing. I'll be in the classroom a lot of time. Like I said, I'm a substitute teacher, and I'll make a reference, and none of the kids know what I'm talking about. I'm like, I'm only 24, but am I that old yet? So,
Nothing like kids to humble you.
oh yeah. So, um, like the last big question I have is, because I like to journal. I haven't done it in a long time. I need to get back in the habit of doing it. Um, but could you give like some journal prompts that people can begin to consider to help um, process their trauma? It could be type specific, or it could just be like humans in general to any human. I'll just let you decide which way to go with that, if you can.
Yeah. I think I'll go general with this one because trauma is so unique to the individual. Regardless of type, I think these are some helpful things to process. Um, and the first one is just, can I name what happened to me?
Yeah.
We can't heal what we can't name.
Mm.
Um, so unless we're able to label something and identify and diagnose what the issue was, if we can't do that, we're just treating symptoms.
Yeah.
And it's like sticking a band-aid on my belly button because my stomach hurts, thinking that's going to help it feel better
Mm.
when that's not the issue, right?
Yeah.
So can I name what's happened to me? Because if we don't have the tools or the definitions or the terms in place, we can't really deal with the actual issue.
Yeah.
And then once we come to naming it, there is that center of intelligence and stance around it of how does that make me feel? Or what
Yeah.
do I think about what happened to me? Or what do I want to do about what happened to me? Can be helpful. Um, and I think that those probably are the first two. If you can get past those two questions, then there's more work to do about it. But the hardest part generally is just naming the experience at all,
Yeah.
and then being able to figure out a way, how do I tell this story in a way that someone will hear it and receive it?
Words cannot express the amount of gratitude that I have for each and every one of my listeners. So, if you would like to support Enneagram Store podcast even more, you can do so by sending a tip by going to enneagramrestore.com/tip jar. That's enneagramrestore.com/tip jar. That's ENNEAGRAMRestore.com/TIPJAR. enneagramrestore.com/tip jar. Well, that was all of my questions I have, and I always like to end with like a little fun "Would you rather" game. But before we go there, is there anything that you would want to add that maybe we haven't talked about yet?
No, I think this has been great.
All right. Well, if you're up for it, I got a few "Would you rather" questions, and uh, forewarning, these all come from a Teen Vogue online article. So,
Let's go for it.
would you rather discover a new planet or find sunken treasure?
I think new planet would be exciting.
All right. Would you rather swim in the ocean at night knowing a shark could be nearby, or spend the night in a house you believe was haunted?
Oh, I think I have to go with house on that one. The ocean's a little bit too open.
I like it. I'm an ocean. I can't swim, but I'm like I love the ocean, and it just doesn't make sense how I can't swim, but would love to be on the ocean all the time. But would you rather spend the day reading or hiking?
Can I do both? I'll read while hiking. Um, yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
I'll go
I
with hiking.
okay. I, if I remember right, you do kind of like do backpacking and stuff like that, right?
I haven't done much of it, but I do love being outdoors.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so I tried to pick some questions that would be like for you and make you really think. So this next one might be a hard one too. Would you rather walk the Great Wall of China or climb the pyramids of Machu Picchu?
I would happily do either. They're both enormous monuments that would be
Yeah.
amazing to see in real life.
Oh yeah. Um, would you rather only be able to read 19th century literature or only be able to read comics?
Comics.
Okay. Be honest with you, that's not the one I imagined you were going to pick. And these last two, I am asking everyone, especially this next one, because it is one of my biggest pet peeves. So I've got to know everybody's opinion on it. Would you rather always have damp socks or always have a pebble in your shoe?
I think a pebble in my shoe because damp socks are just the worst.
Yes, yes, that is the right choice. This last one is a little bit philosophical. Would you rather travel back in time to meet your ancestors or travel forward in time to meet your descendants?
Hmm. I think it'd be pretty cool to go forward.
Well, with that being said, how can people connect with you on the World Wide Web and find out
Yeah.
more about everything you do?
I'm most active on Instagram at Broken to Beloved. We have a website, brokentobeloved.org, and you can find all of the other stuff kind of connected there as well.
All right. Well, I want to say one last time, thank you for sitting and having a conversation with me. I know, which is always the case, every guest has always left me really thinking about my own life, even though I didn't intend any of the questions to come back and reflect on me. So, um, thank you for that.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, that concludes another wonderful conversation on Enneagram Restored podcast. I said it 1,000 times before, and I'll say it again. Thank you, Brian, for taking the time to have a conversation with me. And as well, thank you all for listening. I appreciate every single person who supports this podcast by pressing that play button, whether it's on the video version or whether you're listening to it on the audio only on a podcast platform. But with that being said, I would love to add more value to this podcast for you all who listen and watch. But I really could use your help to add that value. And there are a couple ways that you can help me add value. The first and foremost is just by doing what you did today and pressing play. Whether you're actively watching, listening to it, or whether you just press play and put it in the background. I know sometimes I will get on my own phone, go on Apple Podcasts, press play, turn the volume down, and just run each episode. And so that is a help too, no matter if you actually listen to it or not. As long as you play the episode from beginning to the end, that helps me, because what that does, it helps the play count go up. And when the play count goes up, I am able to look forward into gaining sponsorships, because honestly right now the podcast is just so small that it's even hard to even think about getting sponsorship through ads, because a lot of advertisers want a bigger audience size, and so with the current stats that's impossible. So that is the most easiest way and the most less costing to you that you can help add value to the podcast. But you can also help add value to the podcast by actually giving financially, and which will allow me to upgrade equipment and to produce this podcast in a better manner, and make the sound better, make the video better, just make it better overall. And so if you would like to do that, you can go to enneagramrestore.com/tip jar. That's enneagramrestore.com/TIPJAR. And that link, as well as any other links that have been mentioned in this episode, will be in the show notes for easy access. And another way you can help add value is by going to Apple Podcast, Spotify, or even just commenting on the YouTube video below with a review, saying what you liked about the episode, what you didn't like about it. And actually, I'll even have a link to the website's page that will allow you to do that directly in the show notes too. But I say this all the time. I don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So if you got a good review, leave it. If it's a bad review, guess what? I want you to leave it, because one of the things I know to be true is that I cannot improve as a business person, as a podcaster, if people aren't telling me what they think I'm doing wrong. Now, I'm a very good person to be able to draw the line in the sand, to be able to draw the boundary of knowing, oh, that is personal opinion, or that might be worth looking into. So just know, just because you say it, don't mean it might change. Because in the end, the be all end all is the fact that I'm going to draw a line and say, I don't think that needs to change. But again, to get to that point, it has to reach a certain level. I'm always willing to look at every perspective, every aspect. Um, but in the end, does it happen is a different story. So, but the final way that you can help support and add value to this podcast is to follow and subscribe to Enneagram Start Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Instagram, and yes, we are on Facebook as well. And as of 2 days ago, I created a TikTok account for however long TikTok is still in existence in the United States. Who knows? That still is up in the air with Congress and everything. But as long as TikTok is there, I'm going to start posting some snippets there as well. That handle is the same across every social media platform, and that is Enneagram Start Podcast. So you can find us there, or go to enneagramstart.com. But whichever way, whether it's through social media, whether it's through giving financially, whether it's by just pressing play and letting it run to get the play count up, or whether it's by leaving a review, whichever way you choose to help support and add value to this podcast, I am immensely, did I say immensely grateful for your support. But until the next episode, as always, I want you to remember that the Enneagram doesn't define you, but it does bring restoration. It helps reshape your thinking and habits.